Welcome to Jewish Culture in Sweden Online. My name is Björn Wiman and I am the culture editor of the Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter. Tonight, I'm going to hold a conversation with the American writer Jonathan Safran Foer on his new book, We Are the Weather, published in Swedish by Norstedts. It's going to be a conversation about the climate crisis, the individual's responsibility, but also, of course, about our current common situation in the corona crisis. Welcome. Hi, Jonathan. So good to see you.
I guess this counts as seeing each other. Yeah.
It does nowadays, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We were supposed to meet in reality on the 12th of March here in Stockholm at an event that arranged by Jewish Culture in Sweden. And I was so disappointed when I found out that you weren't coming. What happened? Why didn't you come?
Well, I was disappointed as well. In fact, it's a trip I had been looking forward to for quite a while. I love Scandinavia. I love being a tourist in Sweden. I love being a writer in Sweden. And so I was very disappointed. What happened was coronavirus. It's interesting how the answer to your question is so obvious now. It's like a joke, but at the time it wasn't obvious at all. And I felt, to be honest, a little bit foolish or embarrassed to be canceling. But in retrospect, of course it was the right decision because actually when I would have been on the plane in the air was when Trump closed down flights from Europe. So there's been so much that's been instructive about this time. And one of the things is how we respond to what we don't know, and how much caution or precaution is too much when it becomes alarmist, and then how much casualness is too much when it becomes just foolish.
There is actually an episode in your book, We Are the Weather, about a similar situation where you decide nothing is more important to you than getting home to your kids. This is during the Hurricane Sandy hitting New York, right?
Right. I was in Detroit when Hurricane Sandy was moving toward New York, and my flight was canceled because of the weather, and I had to make a decision about try to get home or just accept the fact that I probably wouldn't get home for a week or more. And I was able to rent a car, and I drove. I did a reading at night actually in Detroit, and I left at, let's say, 10 o'clock or something. And I drove for, I don't know, 16 hours, something like that, and was able to get home before the storm. And I tell that story in the book because as a kind of cautionary tale, because it made me feel really good to get home. It made me feel like a good dad. And my kids were glad I was there. My parents applauded my parenting. But the truth is, it didn't really matter if I was there or not. What really matters is why storms like Sandy are hitting our cities with such frequency, such historically unprecedented frequency. And it matters that we understand the facts behind that, the science behind it, and that we respond. And I haven't been very good at responding. We know that these superstorms are not the product of climate change, but they're greatly strengthened. They're made more frequent and they're made stronger because of climate change. And yet, in the time around Sandy and for years after, I did nothing at all to try to protect my home, from these weather events. So one could say, well, what on earth could you do? What is the power of an individual against a hurricane? And the answer is both nothing and quite a lot, because we are all participants in a system, and the system has to change. And that change will require each of us changing as individuals, as families, as cultures, whether they are religious cultures or political cultures or national cultures. So that was that was the kind of thinking that inspired me to begin writing We Are the Weather.
How does it feel now to have this book out and then entitled different and more perhaps a more acute crisis hits us at this time? I mean, things in New York at the moment are pretty dark, as far as we read in Sweden.
Well, not really. I mean, they're pretty dark in the same way that climate change is pretty dark, which is to say some people are experiencing it very, very badly, and most people are not experiencing it at all. So the truth is, for the last month, my life has been pretty nice. You know, I've had a lot of time with my kids. Life has slowed down in a way that I really appreciate and hope to carry into post-corona life. That having been said, many, many people are suffering terribly, suffering and dying. And in the coming months and years, many, many people are going to suffer. But as with climate change, it's not always a coincidence who's lucky and who's not lucky. You know, I live in a country unlike yours where not everybody has healthcare. I live in a country unlike yours where there really isn't a good network where the society takes care of those who are more vulnerable economically. So, you know, the countries that are most responsible for climate change are the ones that are feeling it least and that will feel it least. And the countries that are least responsible, in places like Bangladesh, are feeling it most powerfully. So one could say nobody is really responsible for coronavirus, but that's not entirely true. We know where these viruses come from. 8 out of the last 11 global flus have all originated on factory farms. You know, one of the lessons that we're learning, which is a lesson that even a child could intuit, is that if you're sick, you should keep a distance from people because sickness travels between, the flu in any case, travels between people. So it doesn't care if you are Norwegian or Finnish or Danish or Swedish. It is completely indifferent to national borders. As it turns out, flus are also completely indifferent to species borders. When we talk about the novel coronavirus, the word novel means it's new to humans, that it had existed in other animals and it made a shift to humans. So if I were to say to you, how would you feel if Finland and Norway's response to coronavirus was to pack all of their citizens into high school gymnasiums and give them drugs that would keep them able to work even though it was destroying their immune systems, and they cut the number of doctors they had by 100. You would say, that's crazy. You would say they're going to die in much greater numbers than they need to. And you would say it's going to make us die because that sickness will not be contained where it is. But that's exactly what we've done on farms. You know, we're creating conditions that are as if we were trying to create these viruses. So, and the people who are predominantly eating this food are people who live in wealthy countries. So, you know, in a moment like this, when people are dying, it can feel premature, or it can even just feel wrong to think about what lessons we might learn. There's a temptation to say, let's just learn those lessons later, once we've gotten through this. On the other hand, we're in this unusually vulnerable and open moment when I think people are looking at what kind of change might be not only necessary, but possible now, in terms of health and safety, and also in terms of, as I was saying, like our habits. You know, do we want to be away from home as often as we are? Do we need to fly as often as we felt that we did? How can we slow things down? How can we have a more deliberate and attentive life? And so that really spans our behavior, from domestic behavior in our homes to what kinds of industries we want to support.
I think we're going to get back to the lessons from the corona crisis and the parallels between the corona crisis and the climate crisis in the end of our short conversation here. I've written a fair amount of pieces and even a book on climate crisis myself. So I really have to recommend to all you guys looking at this that you must read Jonathan's book. It's a book that even for me, having read it and having been engaged in this issue for many years now, there is one episode I remember more than the others. And it's not about climate, actually. It's about your grandmother. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, my grandmother was ill and in fact passed away in the year or year and a half that I was writing this book. So she heavily influenced my thinking. And I tell the story in the book of how she escaped her village in Poland as the Nazis were approaching, as they were moving east. And the story that I tell is that everybody knew what was happening. She didn't have any privileged information. She wasn't any smarter than anybody else. She wasn't more afraid of dying. And yet she was the only person who left. Her parents stayed, her siblings stayed, her cousins, her friends. And one could say that she was the only one who believed what she knew. And that, in a way, is one of the central themes of We Are the Weather. Why is it sometimes so difficult to believe what we know? And then what do we do with that fact? When it comes to climate change, we've known about climate change for decades and decades. In my own life, I've known about it with like in depth for 5 years, at least 10 years. I would never have denied what the scientists were saying. And yet I'm not sure that I was really capable of believing what they were saying. At least not, it motivated me to attend marches and to wear t-shirts and carry posters and say the right things at dinner parties. But I'm not sure it led me to change my life in the ways that I've always known were necessary.
The concept of imagination, of creative imagination, has a key role in your thinking on this issue. Can you explain a bit about this?
Well, let's look at like the difference between coronavirus and climate change. It's really remarkable if you think about it, the extent to which the world has mobilized against coronavirus. I'm not even sure I would have believed it possible. That every single individual I know and every single individual you know and every single individual watching this has changed his or her life in some way in response. Every government has changed in some way in response. Every industry has changed in some way in response, and very, very quickly. And to an extent that is far greater, frankly, than what's needed to solve climate change. And we know far less about coronavirus than we know about climate change. So why is it that in one case, we are so able to act on incomplete knowledge, and in the other case, we find it seemingly impossible to act on very robust knowledge? I think, and please tell me if you have a different opinion, but I think the difference is, in this case, we're afraid for ourselves. If the Swedish government said to its citizens, we need to close down all business, otherwise people in Bangladesh are going to get coronavirus, my guess is Sweden wouldn't do that. And if the Swedish government said, we need everybody to wash their hands, much more often and rigorously, otherwise people in Bangladesh will get coronavirus. At least in America, I don't think we would do it. I don't even think we would wash our hands. So that's where the imagination comes in. Climate change requires a kind of moral imagination to imagine oneself into the suffering of others, whether those others are people who live on another part of the planet or people who live in the future. Because the reality is climate change is not going to make us fearful for ourselves in time. Like, fear will not be a motivating incentive. So what will? And it will have to be moral imagination.
What you advocate in your book is the individual's responsibility and the need for individuals to understand their potential in creating a structural change. And the key concept for you here is what you eat. So what do you eat?
It's one concept. It's not. If that were the only thing we changed, we would have no hope. So I wouldn't advocate for that kind of change at the expense of other change. We need to be doing everything at once, or rather we need to be doing as much as we can at once. So what we know is that there are 4 activities that matter more than all others in terms of an individual's participation in solving this problem, which are having fewer children, controlling overpopulation, flying less, living car-free, or at least driving less and ideally an electric car, and eating fewer animal products. Eating is different than the others for a number of reasons. One, it's the only one of the 4 that immediately addresses methane and nitrous oxide, which are 2 of the most powerful greenhouse gases. Also, it's a choice that we make many times every day, and which for me and for you and for people watching this is not a constrained choice. For some people in the world, it is a constrained choice, but for citizens of Sweden and the United States, it's not a constrained choice. We eat what we want to eat. More than half of the flights that are taken in the world are for business or for non-leisure personal purposes. One of the things coronavirus is teaching us is that maybe we don't need to fly for business, and maybe we don't even need to fly for personal purposes nearly as much. 85% of people who have cars drive to work, and most of the cities in Europe and in America were designed to require cars. So it's not really fair to or whether it's fair or not, it's not reasonable to expect that people are suddenly going to stop flying and driving. And kids, overpopulation is another story altogether. But eating is a choice that is available to us. It's readily available to us. And it matters. It's not a coincidence that Al Gore is a vegan for environmental reasons. It's not a coincidence that Greta Thunberg is a vegan for environmental reasons. When I was on my book tour in the United States, and I was in conversations just like this one, almost always with a climate scientist. Every single climate scientist I was on stage with was a vegetarian. And it shocked me. I had no idea. I really had no idea. And when I would ask them about it, they said, well, I don't drive an SUV and I don't eat meat. It just kind of goes without saying. It wasn't a question of identity. It was just kind of common sense for somebody who was engaged with the science. And I think that that's a very, very important shift that's happening now, is moving away from it being an identity, where people are vegetarians almost in the same way that they might be religious, or belong to a political party. And that runs the risk of feeling good, but not necessarily doing good. What's important, what's essential is that we recognize what the cause and effect chain is, what the activities are that we do that destroy the environment, and to do as little of those things as possible, with the acknowledgement that almost everybody is going to continue to do them to some extent. But the planet doesn't require us to all become vegans. It doesn't require us never to be in a plane or a car or to stop having kids. It just requires us to do far, far less of those things than we currently do.
And you have your own sort of recipe for this, don't you? What did you have for breakfast, for example, or lunch, perhaps, if you had that already?
Well, today's been a slightly weird day. I had popcorn for lunch. What did I have for breakfast? I don't even remember.
But no milk or meat, right?
No,
No.
for sure, no. I find that, so what the most comprehensive analysis of the relationship between food and farming has said that while certain people in the world who don't have access to other kinds of food or who are living, calorie deprived lives can eat a little bit more meat and dairy, citizens of Europe and the United States need to eat about 90% less meat and about 60% less dairy. So that's the science. The way we get to that is something that will be different for different people. I've actually met many people in Scandinavia who say, to tell you the truth, breakfast is very hard because we're so used to having yogurt and cheese.
Yeah.
To which I would say, okay, so have your yogurt and cheese for breakfast, but then you have to offset it somehow later in the day. I don't think it's healthy to be rigid, but it's also not healthy to be casual. We need to strike a balance between the two.
I think this is such a wise way of looking at it because, as you say, this is something that grows organically when your engagement grows as well, and you find it more and more impossible to go on as you did before.
Yes, and it feels good. And that's something that we don't talk about very often. We're so used to thinking about the future as requiring sacrifice and requiring a kind of diminished quality of life. And I just don't think that's how it will feel. For anybody who has ever made a choice in life because of your beliefs, you know that it feels good, even when you're saying no to something that you otherwise want. If you think about food, the pleasure of food ends the second that you swallow the last bite. Food doesn't continue to taste good after you've stopped eating it. But the pleasure of eating your values is something you carry around with you. And it's not as immediate as, eating a great steak, and it's not as visceral as eating a great steak. And it would be foolish to pretend that it is, but it's very deep and it's lasting.
One of the questions I often get when talking about climate change and the work for sustainability and a possible future is the question of hope. People often said when Greta Thunberg came forward here, they often said that she inspired them so much because she gave them hope. What's your take on the concept of hope?
I think that it's we pay too much attention to it. I think people by the way, I am also always asked about hope. Mm-hmm. Always. I almost can't remember the last conversation about climate change that didn't involve hope. Hope can be very powerful and very motivating, but it can also be quite dangerous because when we feel hopeful, we feel less pressure to respond. And when we feel hopeless, we feel less pressure to respond. Because in either case, we are not as necessary as we might be. When people feel vulnerable, they tend to go to binaries, to black and white. I do it myself. If I'm not being very vigilant, when thinking about the environment, I will often either think to myself, it's going to be okay. I don't know exactly how, but it's going to be okay. Or I will think we're doomed. And the truth is, it's not going to be okay. And we're not doomed. It's going to be something in the middle. And we're at the beginning of this process of loss. We are going to lose some cities. We are going to lose some species. We're going to lose some percent of the ice sheets. We're going to lose some amount of the earth to wildfires. We're going to lose some number of children to climate-related famines and diseases. We're not going to lose them all, and we're not going to lose none. So then the question is, well, how much loss can we tolerate? Everything that we lose will be because of us. 100% of global warming since the Industrial Revolution was because of human causes. The more of the activities that we do that destroy the planet, the more destruction there will be. The less of those activities that we do, the less destruction that there will be. So rather than think about hope, I prefer to think about that chain of cause and effect, and the question of how can I shape my life to best shape a future?
There's a quote by the former Czech dissident and president also, Václav Havel. I don't know if you heard it. He says that hope is not the conviction of that everything will turn out well in the end, but hope is the conviction that everything that you do, or everything that happens rather, has a meaning. I think that has helped me a lot getting through my doubts about the possibility of creating a better future. And I think it goes as well for the current situation with the corona crisis. Can you see these parallels between these two crises, the corona crisis and the climate crisis? And what are these parallels, if so?
Well, the strongest parallel is that we either solve it together or we suffer it together. We've become so used to an idea that we live as individuals, as disconnected as we want to be. And we think of connection basically in terms of social media and the internet. And we are now being reminded of just how connected we actually are and how globalized the world actually is. It's not the case that I can keep myself safe while other people act recklessly. And it's not the case that they can keep themselves safe if I act recklessly. And similarly with climate change, it will not be solved by liberals, and it will not be solved by young people. Either we will figure out a way for each of us to participate, for 7.5 billion revolutions to be one revolution, or we are going to go down together.
Another thing that in America especially, I know there are several public intellectuals, authors coming forward during the last year with the saying that basically we're doomed, we're fucked, it's over, it's too late to do anything about climate change. All we can do is go down in sorrow and dignity. There is a writer called Royce Granton, there's Jonathan Franzen saying basically the same thing. What would be your response to this?
I've never heard a scientist say that. One of the greatest services that Greta Thunberg has done, I think, for this conversation is actually, it's not simply inspiring people, it's constantly referring them back to the science. We have to listen to the science, whether the science is hopeful or not, whether it's delivering good news or bad. And I have yet to meet a scientist who has said that we're fucked. I have also yet to meet a scientist who says we're okay. Everyone that I've ever met and every piece of writing that I've ever read by a scientist on the subject says we're going to be on a spectrum. We don't know where we're going to land on that spectrum, and it will be determined entirely and only by the choices that we make now.
I think though this goes as well for the situation with the corona crisis, where in the US at least there's a lot of doubt in science at the moment, right?
Yeah, it's hard even to know how to respond to that. It's just so ignorant and so infuriating. It's one thing if you want to, take risks with your own life, but that's not the nature of coronavirus. People who act recklessly put other people in danger. So hopefully our governments will protect us from them.
I'm just gonna round up with this question that might sound a bit silly to you, but I think it's interesting to hear your answer. If your grandmother, your Jewish grandmother, would have been in the age now that she was then, what would she have done?
If she had been like a teenager.
Yeah.
Now, that's a great question. One of the reasons that actually she was concerned when the Nazis were coming is that she was in a socialist youth group. And so she had a strong instinct toward taking care of others and having society and government organized for the purpose of taking care of as many people as possible. Climate change is a crisis of, as I said, earlier in this conversation, selfishness won't motivate us, because I'm going to be fine. And the reality is my kids are going to be fine. They are. My grandkids are probably going to be fine. We are very, very lucky to live where we are, to have what we have. So we have to instead be motivated by the desire to make sure as many people are taken care of as possible. And we've never faced the prospect of so much suffering as we do now. It is very, very humbling and terrifying to think about. And one can, in response to that, it feels very instinctive to feel one's helplessness or one's smallness. But hopefully it is precisely that helplessness and smallness that will motivate everyone to act. The knowledge that each of us can only do a little bit suggests a requirement, that each of us do as much as we can.
Jonathan, I love talking to you, and I was happy to meet you, even though only in this way. And I hope we will meet in reality soon again, and you're warmly welcome back to Sweden whenever you have the possibility.
Well, we just celebrated Passover, and at the end of the Seder, we always say next year in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is not the city of Jerusalem, but an idea of a place that's a little better, a little more peaceful, a little more just. So maybe next year we can meet there.
Next year in Stockholm.
Yeah.
Thank you. And
Okay,
stay safe.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for watching Jewish Culture in Sweden online. Information about coming programs is available on the website. I am Björn Wiman. Take good care of yourselves. Bye.